Hey everybody, we're going to do chapter 16, section 2, early stages of the war, starting on page 480. American Diary. Captain Van Brunt of the U.S. Navy described the historic first battle between metal-plated ships in 1862. The Monitor laid herself right alongside of the Merrimac, and the contrast was that of a pygmy to a giant. Gun after gun was fired by the Monitor, which was returned with whole broadsides from the rebels, with no more effect, apparently, than so many pebble stones thrown by a child. Quoted in official records of the Union and Confederate navies in the War of the Rebellion, 1898. Page 481, War on Land and Sea. Main idea. The Confederates decisively won the first Battle of Bull Run. History and you. Would you eat a picnic lunch while a battle was raging all around you? Read to learn what happened in 1861 when many people did exactly that. The Civil War was fought on sea as well as on land. While the Union and Confederacy mobilized their armies, the Union Navy began operations against the South. In April 1861, President Lincoln proclaimed a blockade of all Confederate ports. Southerners hoped to break the Union blockade with a secret weapon, the Merrimac, an abandoned Union ship. The Confederates rebuilt and covered the wooden ship in iron. The armored vessel, renamed the Virginia, could withstand Union cannon fire. First Battle of Bull Run. Pressure mounted in the summer of 1861, leading to the first major battle of the Civil War. On July 25th, On July 21st, about 30,000 inexperienced Union troops commanded by General Irwin McDowell attacked a smaller, equally inexperienced Confederate force led by General P.G.T. Beauregard. The fighting took place in northern Virginia, about 5 miles from the town of Manassas Junction near a small river called Bull Run. Hundreds of Washington, D.C. residents went to the battle site to picnic and watch. The Yankees drove the Confederates back at first, and the rebels rallied, inspired by reinforcements under General Thomas Jackson. Jackson was seen holding out heroically like a stone wall, and became known thereafter as Stonewall Jackson. The Confederates unleashed a savage counterattack that forced Union lines to break. The Union retreat turned into a mad stampede when retreating Union troops collided with civilians fleeing in panic back to Washington, D.C. The outcome shocked Northerners. They began to understand that the war could be long, difficult, and a costly struggle. President Lincoln President Lincoln appointed a new general, George B. McClellan, to head and organize the Union Army of the East, called the Army of the Potomac, and to train the troops. The loss at Bull Run discouraged Union supporters. Although dismayed by the results, President Lincoln was also determined. Within days, he issued a call for more volunteers for the Army. He signed 2 bills requesting a total of 1 million soldiers to serve for 3 years. Victories in the West raised Northern spirits and also increased enlistment. The War in the West. In the West, the major Union goal was to control the Mississippi River and its tributaries, the small rivers that flow into a larger river. With control of the river, Union ships on the Mississippi could prevent the states of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas from supplying the rest of the Confederacy. Control would also let Union gunboats and troops move in the heart of the South. The battle for the rivers began in February 1862 when Union forces captured Fort Henry on the Tennessee River. The assault was led by Naval Commander Andrew Foote and Army General Ulysses S. Grant. Soon afterward, Grant and Foote moved against Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. The Confederates in Fort Donelson realized that they had no chance of winning the battle, so they asked Grant what terms or incentives he would give them to give up the fort. Grant said, primary source, no terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be granted. From General Grant to General Buckner, February 1862. Unconditional surrender, Grant became the North's new hero. War of the Ironclads. As conflict was raging in the rivers of the West, ships of the Union and Confederate navies were fighting in the Atlantic Ocean. On March 8, 1862, the Merrimac, renamed the Virginia, attacked a group of Union ships off the coast of Virginia. The North's wooden warships could not damage the Confederate ship. Shells simply bounced off its iron sides. Some Northern leaders feared the South would use the ironclad warship to destroy the Union Navy, steam up the Potomac River, and bombard Washington, D.C. The North, though, had an ironclad ship of its own, the Monitor, and this ship rushed toward Virginia. On March 9th, the 2 ironclads met in battle. Neither ship could sink the other. Although the battle was indecisive, it was also historic because it was the first ever between metal-covered ships. The Battle of Shiloh. Meanwhile, in the West, General Grant and about 40,000 troops headed south along the Tennessee. along the Tennessee River toward Corinth, Mississippi, an important railroad junction. In April 1862, the Union Army camped at Pittsburgh Landing, 20 miles from Corinth. Nearby was a church named Shiloh. Additional Union forces came from Nashville to join Grant. Confederate leaders decided to strike first before the reinforcements arrived. Early in the morning of April 6, Confederate forces led by Albert Sidney Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard launched a surprise attack on the Union troops. The Battle of Shiloh lasted 2 days, with some of the most bitter, bloody fighting of the war. Even though Shiloh was a narrow victory for the Union forces, the losses were enormous. Together, the two armies suffered more than 23,000 casualties, people killed or wounded. After Shiloh, Union forces gained control of Corinth on May 30th. Memphis, Tennessee fell to Union armies on June 6th. The North seemed well on its way to controlling the Mississippi River. New Orleans falls. A few weeks after Shiloh, the North won another important victory on April 25th, 1862. Union naval forces under David Farragut captured New Orleans, Louisiana, the largest city in the South. Farragut was one of Spanish descent, grew up in the South but remained loyal to the Union. His capture of New Orleans near the mouth of the Mississippi River meant that the Confederacy could no longer use the river to carry its goods to sea. Together with Grant's victories to the north, the capture of New Orleans gave the Union control of most of the Mississippi River. Only the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, blocked Union control of the river and the success of the Union's western strategy. Reading check, comparing and contrasting. How's the Battle of Shiloh like the first Battle of Bull Run? How are the two battles different? War in the East, main idea. The South won several important victories in the East during 1862, but the Union responded with a vital triumph of its own. History and you. What is the most valuable thing you have lost? Read to learn what happened when a Confederate officer lost some important papers. While Union Confederate forces were struggling for control of the Tennessee and the Mississippi River, another major campaign was being waged in the East to capture Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, was close to the northern Confederate border and vulnerable to attack. Yet it was a matter of pride to defend it at all costs. Repelling one Union advance after another, Confederate armies prevented the fall of Richmond until the end of the war. Victories for the Confederacy. Southern victories in the East were largely the result of the leadership of General Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Though knowledge of the terrain, speed of movement, and the ability to inspire their troops, Confederate forces managed to defeat Union forces sometimes twice as large as their own. In 1862, Confederate forces turned back General George B. McClellan at the 7 Days Battle, General John Pope at the Second Battle of Bull Run, and General Ambrose Burnside at Fredericksburg. In May 1863, at Chancellorsville, Virginia, Lee's army defeated a Union army twice its size. My God, Lincoln said when he learned of the defeat. What will the country say? Victories in the East did not include victories outside the Confederacy. Lee's two attempts to invade the North failed. In September 1862, Lee's army was turned back at the Battle of Antietam. Less than a year later, Confederate forces would force the same fate at Gettysburg. You will read about the Battle of Gettysburg in Section 4. Invasion of the North. Washington, D.C. presented a tempting target for the Confederates, but the city was too well guarded for Lee to consider an attack. On the urging of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, Lee moved his troops instead into western Maryland, Union territory. His goal now was to sweep into Pennsylvania and carry the war into the northern states. Lee knew that McClellan was pursuing him with a sizable force, so he concentrated on moving forward. Lee's forces crossed into Maryland and began an invasion of the North. The Battle of Antietam. Once in Maryland, Lee split his army in 4 parts and instructed them to move in different directions. He hoped to confuse McClellan about the size and destination of the army. The Confederate officer, however, lost his copy of Lee's orders describing this plan. The paper was found by 2 Union soldiers who brought it to McClellan. McClellan did not attack immediately. Lee reassembled his troops, and on September 17, 1862, the two sides met in the Battle of Antietam near Sharpsburg, Maryland. About 6,000 soldiers were killed. About 17,000 more were badly wounded. It was the deadliest single day of fighting during the war. Antietam was an important victory for the Union. Because of the great losses, Lee chose to retreat to Virginia after the fighting. At least for the time being, the strategy of invading the North had failed. The Union could breathe a little more easily. Reading check. Summarizing. What was the outcome of the Battle of Antietam? The Emancipation Proclamation. Main idea. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had an enormous effect in America and abroad. History and you. How do you make difficult decisions? Read to learn about the debate over the war's purpose and how Lincoln eventually settled on a course of action. At first, Abraham Lincoln cast the Civil War as a battle for the Union rather than as a fight against slavery. As the conflict progressed, however, Lincoln changed the way he thought about slavery and its role in the war. The debate. Lincoln hated slavery, yet he was reluctant to make the Civil War a battle to end it. He feared that many Union supporters would strongly oppose such a decision. At the beginning of the war, Lincoln hesitated to move against slavery because of the border states. Even many Northerners who disapproved of slavery were not eager to risk their lives to end it. Other Americans held a different opinion, however. From the start of the war, abolitionists, including orator Frederick Douglass and newspaper editor Horace Greeley, urged Lincoln to make the war a fight to end slavery. These Northerners made several arguments to support their position. First, they argued slavery was a moral wrong that needed to be abolished. Second, they pointed out that slavery was the root of the divisions between North and South. Therefore, the nation could never be fully restored if slavery continued. Finally, Douglass and others brought up the issue of foreign policy. Britain and France each sympathized with the South for economic reasons. Southern leaders were trying to persuade Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy's independence. Public opinion in England and France was strongly anti-slavery. By casting the war as a fight for freedom, Douglass pointed out Lincoln would make Britain and France less willing to support the South. That in turn would help the Union cause. Lincoln decides. Lincoln knew that the Constitution did not give him the power to end slavery. The Constitution did, however, give him the power to take property from an enemy in wartime, and by law, enslaved people were property. On September 22, 1862, soon after the North's victory at Antietam, Lincoln announced that he would issue the Emancipation Proclamation, a decree freeing all enslaved people in rebel territory on January 1, 1863. Effects of the proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation did not actually free a single enslaved person. The proclamation applied only to enslaved people in areas held by the Confederacy. There, Lincoln had no power to enforce the new policy. The proclamation led an important impact in America, however. By issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, the government declared slavery as to be wrong. If the Union won the war, slavery would be banned forever. Reading check. Summarizing. Why did abolitionists believe that Lincoln should make the end of slavery a goal of the war? Section 2, review. Define each of the terms. Abandon, tributary, ironclad, casualty, impact. Main ideas. 2. Analyzing. What factors helped the Confederates win the first Battle of Bull Run? Number 3. Summarizing. What was the final outcome of the Battle of Shiloh?